Hey everyone, I'm Eric Schrader, and in today's video we're going to talk about 5 ways that you can take young material like this and start it on its way to being an interesting bonsai. This is an Ilex vomitoria, or Yaupon Holly, native to the Southeast United States, and it has a nice shiny leaf. It even has a tiny little flower that it gets, a tiny little white flower around May here in San Francisco. So the first technique that we're going to talk about here is wiring. And this is a cutting propagated plant, and the stems are relatively straight. So in order to give it a little bit more character, all I really want to do right now is wrap this aluminum wire around it and give it some more shape. Now, you might think to yourself, well, it's going to take a long time for that to become a bonsai. But regardless of how long it takes, if we have some interesting movement in the core of the plant, it will be a better bonsai than if we didn't wire it. I've actually put 2 wires on there, and now I'm going to use these to add some shape to this. Yaupon Holly is not super cooperative once it has wood, and that means that I have to do this when the branches are relatively young so that they're still flexible and they don't just break. I'm adding movement to each branch, but it's not really too important at this point to be really exact with the movement, or even to make the movement of different pieces go together. This might end up being a sacrifice branch and this the trunk, or vice versa. The wiring that I'm using here is basically just to ensure that I don't have everything just being straight and the same sort of angular pattern that the tree makes by itself. Here's another example of something that you can do with wiring. This is a holly oak that I've been growing for a few years, and if I kind of show it to you guys up close, you can see that I did some wiring down here. The ultimate goal here, I think, is going to allow all of these open spaces here to kind of close up and make a fat little trunk that then I will train short branches on. So for the time being, I'm allowing these larger branches to run to continue that fattening process, and I've just kind of slip potted it into this larger container, actually because it kept falling over in the little container that it was in. But to start that process, I'll demonstrate on this cork oak. I've brushed aside some of the soil, and I am kind of looking at the base. And what I want to do is I want to just kind of find where the trunk hits the nebari, and then I'm going to kind of fold it over almost into like a compacted S shape, maybe not just a 2-dimensional S shape, but more like a 3-dimensional S shape. And I don't want, in order to get this effect, I don't want this turn to come back past the base of the tree. I'm trying to make it kind of that turn hook just inside the base of the tree, the nebari of the tree, so that if it does fuse together, it looks like there's still some taper. So I've gone ahead and done that. That takes a little while to come to fruition, but it can make a really interesting tree. The second thing that you can do with young material like this is to do some selective pruning. This plant has already been wired, and it's the same as this one, Yaupon Holly. It has a wired section in here, but it also has these strong branches that are taking off. Now, if I leave these on, they're going to be great and help bulk up this trunk, but at the same time, they might take over, and this part that I've already wired might get weak. So I can do some selective pruning here to slow down the growth that I don't want to take off too quickly, and at the same time, I'm going to leave the growth that's on the wired portion of the trunk to continue to run and fatten up. The selective cutback applies to a lot of different species, and you should understand how your plant grows before you just go cutting it back. If this were a pine tree, I would make sure that I was timing the cutback carefully to ensure success in terms of budding after the cuts are made. With a holly, the timing is not quite as important, but it'll have a similar effect. This will slow these guys down, and these guys will continue to grow. And so I'll kind of set in motion that this portion of the trunk that I had previously wired becomes the main trunk for the composition, and that's what I want because it already has more character. All right, third, if you're not working on the roots on your plant, it's not going to be a good bonsai. With these guys, they've been in these containers for a little while, and so it's not repotting season, and I don't want to get in here and do too much work to them. But what I can do is just kind of take a look at the nebari that is starting to form down in here by brushing away the topsoil like I'm doing, either with the scissors or a pair of tweezers or something like that. All right, in this case, this tree has a little bit of callus tissue here that I'm just going to leave alone, but I like the structure of the roots. And so what I'm really looking for here is to try to even it out. But these roots are relatively young, and that means that I might not actually be able to do a whole lot with them at this stage. The other thing that going in and checking out the nebari will show you is to make sure that you haven't left a straight section at the bottom of your tree when you wired it. So I'm going to go ahead and try to bend that a little bit without breaking it. Ilex are prone to breaking. I didn't do much more than cut off a couple of squiggly little roots and basically just pull it out and put more soil underneath. It doesn't need to have the soil up above like it did before. And that's pretty much all I need to do right now. And working with the nebari at this stage will ensure that as this tree continues to develop, it starts to create a really nice base. Next up, planting in pairs. If you haven't before, think about planting things in pairs. It can create a really interesting composition if you move away from just using single plants. And you can go for pairs, you can go for triplets, threes, and you can go for bigger clumps. But the classical kind of like two trunk or two tree composition can be really interesting in bonsai. And maybe in this composition, I'm going to go for a taller composition, but just by having the two trees in one container from a young age, it really helps to just get your creative juices flowing and make sure that you have the chance to create not just one style of bonsai, maybe not just an informal upright, but also other styles of bonsai. Now in this example, I've gone ahead and wired the trunks. When I'm planting in pairs, especially with two trees like these two pines, I tend to want to wire the trunks so that one is shorter than the other. That's a sort of classical bonsai rule. And when they're young like this, you're not going to be making the final decision. In other words, you're going to have to come back and review all of this. But just creating a little bit tighter movement in the smaller one and looser movement in the bigger one gives you an interesting way that the two trees go together that's different than just having a single tree in your composition, but makes them kind of look interesting. Last up, repeated pinching or repeated anything. A few weeks ago, I published a video about trimming back these elms in spring, and it really has only been a few weeks, and they've already taken off and are sending out additional shoots. And I have, I think, maybe 6 of these that I've been puttering around with in my yard. And the point I'm trying to make here is that repeated cutback and pruning can cause some interesting effects, different than what you get from just wiring or alternating wiring and pruning. And that's sort of the experiment that I'm running on these elm trees that I propagated from root cuttings. Essentially, every time I cut them, it's adding a little bit of character to the tree, and it's increasing the number of twigs. Even though the trunks aren't large, every time I do something like this, I'm adding interest to the plant. Finally, I'll just circle back to basically where I started, which is with another one of these ilex that I'm growing from cuttings. Sometimes if you want the trunk to bulk up, you basically just have to wait. And I've already wired this, I've already pruned it back a couple of times. I could come in here and do selective pruning like I did on the other one to make sure that this section starts to dominate, but I can also just let this grow on for another year. And so don't feel like you always have to do something. First, I like to say basically do something to create interest in the plant, any one of the things that I've talked about today, but then give the plant some time to grow so that it sort of builds up more wood, builds up more metabolism, and then you can come back in and modify it again, create more interest. I hope these ideas have helped you get your bonsai on their way to being interesting and super cool. If you have additional ideas that you want to share with people, put them in the comments below. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.